The process of maturing for all of us is the process of throwing off all of these assumptions that we think we understand about the world and coming up with a better understanding of the world. We increase and we grow in our measure of wisdom, our intellect, our understanding of the world, and possibly our waistlines. But the process of maturing is growing in these areas. Now, for all the Gospels, the way they choose to introduce Jesus to us, they do it in different ways. Both Matthew and Luke talk about the birth of Jesus. We see Christ coming into the world and the rejoicing of the angels and all of creation pausing to see the emergence of Jesus. John doesn't even waste any time with that. When he wants to introduce Jesus, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If you want to know Jesus, you can't go to the birth. You have to understand the preexistence and the preeminence of Jesus. But Luke, and Mark wastes no time with that. He's like, nah, Jesus did things in his ministry. So it picks up, and you're like, who is Jesus? He's just here talking to John the Baptist. But Luke is the only gospel that gives us an account of one of those between times, the time between the birth of Christ and him as a man engaging in the ministry that he's called to, right? And so it's here in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, he gives us this nugget where he says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. I think that is a statement about the whole process of growing up and maturity. It's also a comment, really, about the role that Joseph and Mary played in the life of Jesus. It says something about who they were because we see Jesus growing in all of these ways, not just in stature, but in wisdom. And in his wisdom and his stature, he developed relationships, both with the people around him and with God. That is a process of parents who are involved. This is Jesus maturing the way we want and expect for somebody to. And there are all sorts of questions you probably have about how the Son of God, who is God himself, matured in wisdom and stature in favor of God and man. And I'm not going to answer those questions, except it's cool that Luke gives us this picture of maturity in Jesus. I want to take a look at that text one more time. And we want to read it in Luke chapter 2 because I want to park on this idea for just a little bit. Luke chapter 2, verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be with the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives. And have you ever lost your child in a grocery store? It's like a 1,000 times worse than that. They left him a day's journey away. They drove to Oregon without him, right? Okay. But supposing him to be with the group, they went a day's journey, but then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, I don't know if this is 3 days in Jerusalem searching for him or 3 days from the moment he was not with them. So this is like 3 to 5 days, right? They're without their son. So after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, listen up, kids. Listen up. And his mother said to him, son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. And he said to them, why are you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? And as a kid, I gravitated toward this text. Just to realize that, okay, well, this is cool because Jesus is 12 and he got into trouble like I got into trouble. And I'd like to point out to my parents occasionally that even Jesus couldn't make his parents happy. Your poor kids. Welcome, kids. What did you learn in Bible class? I don't remember, but I know Jesus couldn't even make his parents happy. He says, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? If you have a different translation, it might actually read in that text, it might read, I must be about my Father's business, for example. There's a Hebrew phrase there that's kind of hard to translate. It literally means, I must be in the things that are my Father's. Occasionally, translators have a rough time as they're like, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean be in his Father's dwelling? Does that mean being about his Father's business? What Jesus is saying, I got to be around my Father's things, right? I must be in the things that are my Father's. And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. Verse 51, and then they went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. I think most of us here know that Jesus was trained as a carpenter. You might only know it because of the bumper stickers that go by. My boss is a Jewish carpenter, right? It's actually in the Bible, although there's some debate about whether it's carpentry or another type of building profession. But it's in the Bible, both in Mark and in Matthew, recording the same account. When Jesus goes to his hometown in Galilee to try to do miracles, people in that town rejected him because they said, we know who this person is. We know who his dad is. We know his mother, his sisters, his brothers. Who is he to teach us as a rabbi? Right? Jesus is there teaching, and both in Mark, it says, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense to him. When Matthew records it, he records another one of those jeers, but he does it differently. Instead of accusing Jesus of being a carpenter, we now discover that Joseph also was a carpenter, right? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, right? So, same situation, a whole bunch of people throwing accusations at Jesus that essentially say, we know who you are. We know where you set up shop in town. We know where you came from. Have you ever wondered why Jesus was a carpenter? Because his dad was. And while that might sound incredible to us today, it was actually really common back then. Jesus did ministry at an interesting point in time in history. In fact, going before this, there was no real formal training for hundreds of years before this. There was no real codified formal training for young men or women in how to learn about the statutes of God. Right about the time Jesus came, the Jewish faith was the Jewish people started enforcing regulated classes. Kids had to go to primary school, over to the synagogue. There was a room off to the side. Both young men and young women had to go and learn and be trained in studying the Torah, the law. And so up until 10, they actually spent 5 days a week in school, learning, studying. They couldn't necessarily even read, though most of them learned to read, but they learned to memorize it. And by the time they left school, compulsory school, at 10 years old, most of them had memorized all of the books of the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They memorized Leviticus. Right? And the reason they were released at 10 years old to go back home was, and just a little bit later, they added a secondary education. So the Jewish system of training people was growing. Right at the time Jesus was there, some people were training their kids in the synagogue. Some people were not, depending on where you lived. But right at 10 years old, they released kids to go back home. If they continued their training, they did it after 13 because they went home to learn from their father a trade. In fact, it is the expectation that by the time a kid was 13 years old, he knew his father's trade. So if his dad was a carpenter, he knew carpentry. If his father was a stonemason, he knew masonry. It's because by the time you're 13, remember, in the Jewish faith, 13 is you're celebrating adulthood at this point. And so it is a father's expectation, it's his obligation to teach his son what it is to be a man in commerce and in trade. So he taught his son, by the time he was 13, how to run a business and how to do a trade. Which is why it's not by coincidence that in Luke chapter 2, Jesus is 12 and he lingers in the temple. And he says, "Don't you know I must be about the things that are my Father's?" Now before this time, where kids would go to school and they would have structured moments of learning the Torah, and they learned to study, to read, to memorize it. Before this time, who was responsible for teaching children? Yeah, the Bible is actually really, really clear about this. The very first instruction that God gives to his people as they've been redeemed from Egypt is this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently." So you have the confession of Israel, right? You are my people. You only have one God. It is me. I am your God. There's one God. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Your job is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And then you have one more job if you're adulting as an Israelite. That last job is to teach your children. No, there's not a formalized educational system. It's not as articulate or as graded or as refined as what we have today. But the job of teaching the children about the covenant with God belongs to the parents. And so he says, "And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk." You don't send them off to school, but if you're going to be sitting, you might as well talk about God. If you're going to be walking along the wayside, you might as well talk about God. Every moment they have an opportunity to enter the house or to leave the house, they should know about the covenant before God. "You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." In other words, this relationship that I have as God with you, my people, this should be the central point of teaching for you with your children. And that is your job, parents. Teach them to your children. Teach them when you lie down. Teach them when you get up. Teach them when you walk along the way. If your kid somehow misses it, put it on the front of the door. Write it on their hands. The responsibility of teaching our kids, and I think this is broader. This is specifically about our faith and our covenant with God, but the idea is broader than that. The responsibility of teaching children about life belongs to the parents. Proverbs, one passage of many in Proverbs. "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland around your head and pendants for your neck." Over and over and over in Proverbs, the job of a parent is to instruct their children. The job of children is to listen, grow, learn, and do. But we seem to be, just take a moment to recognize the gravity of this requirement, of this teaching. The job of a parent is to raise their children in every aspect of life. To train them spiritually, to mold their character, to refine who they are, to train them to do a job and a task, to give them a work ethic. The job of a parent is so much broader often than what we actually talk about it. There's a slow simmering feud in my household right now. My son, Jesse, we haven't kept track. We're terrible parents. You know how some parents mark it on the walls so they know how much their kids grow? We don't have any walls like that in my house. But I'm telling you, I think my son has grown 5 or 6 inches in 1 year. Unbelievable. And there is this slow, simmering feud between my son and my wife. And I occasionally get a glimpse of this feud as we're sitting there. You know, Kim and I are sitting in the living room, and I'll hear her mumble something. What's that? She'll mumble it a little bit louder. What are you saying? I bought him new pants. Why is he wearing those? Because on any given day, if you come into my house, you'll find my son either in pants that fit him perfectly, or you will find him wearing pants that look like this. And really, it's a flip of a coin. On any given day, he's going to look like he's a well-cared for, well-tended, well-clothed child, or we are going to look like the most neglectful parents you've ever seen in your life, because we cannot keep our children in clothes. Right? This is how dads react to this. I just kind of enjoy the whole thing. I probably shouldn't. I should take it more seriously that my job is to clothe my children and house my children and feed my children and all these other things. I'm somewhat entertained by it. I asked Jesse last week, I said, why do you do this? Why do you wear those pants? You have pants that fit you. And he goes, yeah, I do. But if I take these pants out of circulation, I have to do laundry a lot more. The whole picture comes together. There are some things that you and I can acknowledge right out of the gate. We recognize this is the role of a parent, right? It's the role of the parent to provide food for your kids, to provide clothing for your kids, to provide shelter for your kids, a house, a bedroom, a place where they can be safe, right? We recognize that that's the role of a parent. Everybody in our culture recognizes that. But beyond that point, things get fuzzy. Beyond that point, in our culture today, in America, the obligations of the parent become really kind of fuzzy. And we're there because we live in a time that's radically different. Modern America's radically different than most of the rest of the world. It used to be that there was no school to educate your kids, and so you recognized that job was your job. To train them for a career was your job, and you were likely training them for the only career you knew, which was the career you had. Today, we live in this marvelous envelope of time when your kids will be raised, and you'll ask them, well, what are you going to do for a living? I mean, that was not a question in Jesus' day. They knew what they were going to do because they were going to be trained by their father to do a trade. But today, my kids go to school. They eventually get to studies that I don't know how to help them with anymore. And they grow in tremendous intellect to the point where there is no door that is closed to them. And so we regularly ask our kids, instead of training them up, yes, son, yes, daughter, you will do what I have been doing, right? We go, who will you be? What will you do? The destination for our kids, for their careers, is mostly out of my hands as a parent. Surprisingly, it's a lot more hands-off than it ever used to be. And we place it in the hands of schools. And parents are so hands-off. Just recognize the fact that you can choose a vocation that was not your father's. This is unique in this period of time and history. the tremendous opportunities that our kids have to do something different than what you are doing. Incredible. But it blurs the lines about who parents should be. Because parents can and have been so unattached to the development of their kids intellectually, emotionally, morally, that schools now hire guidance counselors to direct kids where they should go in their career. And what I've noticed is that in our culture, we don't just outsource this training up kids intellectually. We outsource a lot of things. If you're going to be training your kid to have great character or good sportsmanship, you might take them to Little League or to soccer or to karate or to something else where somebody else can then train them in these areas too, right? The idea that parents are responsible for this seems to sometimes be co-opted as today we outsource more and more and more of the responsibilities of our kids. And yeah, you can probably see this and recognize that we do that, but surely we don't outsource the faith formation of our kids, do we? Last Wednesday, just an informal poll. Last Wednesday, I was working with the youth program. We had about 17 kids there. 2 of them had parents. The rest of the kids were dropped off or came by themselves. I have books on my shelf from my youth ministry days that are titled "After You Drop Them Off." They're meant for parents, for youth ministers to give to parents to say, please still be involved in the life of your children, in the faith formation of your children. Because for some reason, we adopt massive programs like youth ministry, like a kidmin program, like Bible class, and we assume that if these things are in place, then the job has been taken care of. But it's not true. It's still not true. Your job as a parent before God is to train up this child to know their faith. Now, Bible class can be a tool, and youth programming can be a tool, and you can have a child that attends none of those at all and still grows up to be a responsible believer in Jesus Christ because of the faith of the parents and how active the parents are. But you cannot believe that that actually takes the place of being a parent. And in the spiritual realm, this is wildly obvious to me, but it's also true based on a kid's intellect and based on a child's character. Parents who are not engaged in those aspects are shortchanging their kids because school is still not a substitute for finding direction in a person's life. And so, yeah, in this world of fuzzy expectations about what is the job of a parent, I want to tell you that if your kid is trying to figure out who they should be, what career they should pursue, and you're not there with them in that conversation, I want you to know that's your job. You should be. And okay, maybe in Jesus' day, it was a little bit too invasive because they did like arranged marriages, right? So maybe today, we're not going to do an arranged marriage, but if your child is looking for somebody to date, to spend the rest of their life with, you should be on the front lines with them because that's your job as a parent. I get that in our culture, the responsibility of a parent becomes fuzzy because we have all these other tools available, but they are not an opportunity to check out. I'm actually very thankful. I don't know if you've taken the time to recognize how many hard workers we have at Lakeview who invest in the next generation. We We have ministries at this congregation. We have people who pour time and energy. I think we're going to be having an appreciation banquet for our teachers in not too long. This congregation has men and women who pour time and energy into our kids in the youth program, in Bible classes, in KidMin, in VBS. We are an active out at Delano. We are an active congregation in training up our children. That is a blessing. But it's only a blessing if our parents are really engaged in this process. A couple weeks ago, one of the many things that I'm going to pick on Jesse one more time. Sorry, Jesse. I love you, kid. One of the many things that has changed over this last year with my son as he's grown in stature and wisdom, in favor of God and man, is that he used to visit the refrigerator only 2 or 3 times a day. I don't know if I can count that high now. He visits 9, 12, 15, 20 times a day. My son intimately knows the contents of our refrigerator. A couple weeks ago, late at night, right before, there's the pre-bedtime snack, and then it's not midnight, it comes before midnight, but there's the after bedtime, but then I woke up and I want a burrito snack, right? Those snacks happen all over the day, which is great. I get that that's part of the gig. You know, you sign up as a parent, you're going to feed the bottomless leg, the kid that just, right, that's part of the gig. I don't begrudge that at all. Binge eating teenagers. There was this one time I stay up fairly late, usually working on something or watching a show, and there was this one time the whole house had been shut down. Jesse got up out of his room, walked over to the fridge, and I think he was going for a burrito. I don't really remember, but I remember that the kitchen was dark. My son had the fridge open. You know, the only light in the kitchen was the glow of the refrigerator on a young man trying to look for something to eat. And I thought, good grief, this kid has an appetite. And he packed up and he went back to his room. And the more I reflected on it, the more I realized, yeah, God gave him an appetite for food. And yes, it's my responsibility to have something in that fridge for that kid. But God gave him another appetite. And it's deeply profound to consider the implications of the spiritual appetite that God gives to our children. The Bible talks about this, not just in terms of kids, but in terms of our spiritual walk. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will be in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. Isaiah 55, before Jesus breaks out on the scene, says, come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and why your labor on what does not satisfy? Maybe most eloquently, because we sing this in some of our songs, Psalm 63. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. I would like to suggest to you, moms and dads, that if you have a little baby that you're holding on to and your mind is racing about who she or he will become, what they will do, what great and mighty things they will accomplish, if you're waiting, a kid is like a present that takes like 20 years to unwrap, right? You got this baby and they will become something someday. All that anticipation, right? All those books that you're neurotically reading to try to figure out what to feed them and when. please recognize that God has given them an appetite for more than just food. It is our responsibility to see that they grow in stature and in character and in favor with God and men. And I don't want to share this as though it is only parents that are on the hook for some of this, because when the Bible talks about people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, when it talks about this appetite and this desire, it's not kids that God is talking about. The fact is, every one of us has an appetite. We hunger and we thirst for righteous things, for spiritual things, for God. And in fact, recognizing that that is a part of the human calling, that we crave and desire spiritual things. Only when we understand that do we understand why the Bible talks about the role of church leaders in terms of being a shepherd. Right? The psalm suddenly makes sense. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me to green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. That relationship between a shepherd and the sheep, not any different than this relationship I'm talking about between parent and child. There is a hunger, there is an appetite, and there is a desire. But I want you to know that as a congregation, we want to be attentive to you if you have a need.